Good evening. We're on Daf Yudalid in Masechet Yoma, and we recall that the Gemara pointed out that the Mishnah, which establishes that the Kohen Gadol has to quarantine for 7 days, and during this period of time prepare himself for the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, he was subject to Hazah from the Mechatos on a daily basis in order to prepare himself for Tahara, so that he would be pure when he served in the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara points out that that cannot be reconciled with Rabbi Akiva. So why is that? Because Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that if you take the Mechatos and you do a Hazah on a Tahar, on someone who is not impure, it makes him Tameh. Now, if we're going to do this daily for a week before the Avodas Yom Kippurim commences, then the Kohen Gadol is now disqualified for Avodah, because according to Rabbi Akiva, once we do the Hazah, the Mechatos, on a Tahar, he becomes Tameh. And the question is there any way that we could possibly reconcile our Mishnah and the entire enterprise of Prisha of the Kohen Gadol with the Hazah on a daily basis with Rabbi Akiva? Could Rabbi Akiva square with our Mishnah? The Gemara first asks, what's the reason for Rabbi Akiva? Where did he come up with this idea that a tar becomes Tameh because they sprinkled on him the Mechatos? And the Gemara says that he derived it from the Pasuk in the Parsha of Parah Aduma, the Parsha of Chukas. It says there, Vehiza Hatar Olaf. Fine. Then it says, Vehiza Hatar Al Hatame. And the question is, why did the Torah feel compelled to repeat Al Hatame? The whole subject of the parsha is a tameh and how to purify someone who's tameh. So why did the Torah say Vehiza Hatar Al Hatameh? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva derived from the Al Hatameh, those two redundant words, that Al Hatameh Tar Al Hatar Tameh, that the Torah is telling you that through this Hazah, on a tameh he becomes tar, but on a tar, he becomes Tameh. So that the Vehiza al ha-Tameh is coming to tell you that, yeah, it's Tara because he's a Tameh. But if he would have been a tar, he would be Tameh as a result of the Hazah. So again, just to summarize, Rabbi Akiva's very paradoxical shita is that if you're mazeh from the Mechatos on a tar, he becomes Tameh. Now, when I say paradoxical, I mean business, because Rabbi Akiva says that this is what Shlomo HaMelech meant when he declares in Koheles, Amarti ech kama v'hi rechoka mimeni. I studied the Parsha of Parah Aduma, and I, as the greatest intellect that ever lived, should have been able to crack the nut and figure out what's going on. And Rechoka Mimenu, it's far, far away from me. Because how can we understand that the Mechatos now becomes a conduit of Tumah? The whole purpose of Mechatos is to be Mitayr, and now the Mechatos itself is being Mitame. The Chachamim rejected Rabbi Akiva. According to them, when the Torah says Al Hatameh, it means something else entirely. It has to do with the Mayim and the status of the Mayim. We'll get to that in just a minute. But according to the Chachamim, Rabbi Akiva's conclusion is anti-logical. It's irrational. Why? Because if the Mechatos is endowed with the power to be Mitayr, someone who's Tameh, then for sure it would not be Matamani, someone who's tar. And the Gemara now offers an alternative understanding of the pasuk, Vehiza hatar al atame, according to the Chachamim. And ahu, if you ask me, what is absolutely strange about this process of para with regard to the Mei Paraduma, the Mei Chatos, and why is it that Shlomo Melech declared, I can't figure it out? It's for a different reason. Ahu lemazeh ulemazin olav tahar v'anogea bahen tameh. The person, the Kohen who's in charge of Hazah, he does the sprinkling. And the person who is tameh, who now is on the receiving end, both of them are tar. However, nogea bahem, if somebody touches the mei chatos, he is tameh. Why is it that the mazeh, who dips his hand and does the hazah, he remains tar, and the tameh upon whom we're being mazeh becomes tar because he was tameh and now he's tar, and yet the nogea bahem is tameh. Now, what does that mean? Nogea bahem is tameh. First of all, you have to ask yourself the following question: it's impossible to separate between the mazeh and the nogea, because the mazeh who does the hazah, according to Chachamim, remains tar. And then you're telling me that a nogea b'mei chatos is tameh. Well, the mazeh is certainly a nogea b'mei chatos. Why isn't he become tameh? The answer is that there's a difference between the mazeh and the nogea. The mazeh comes in contact with the mei chatos for the purpose of being mitayra tameh. That's called litzorech. The case of an nogea is someone else who decides on his own, for whatever reason, he wants to come in contact and touch the mei chatos. He has no interest in doing a hazah, litzorech hazah. He's not protected by the mitzvah of hazah because he's not motivated. He's not fulfilling the mitzvah of hazah. Shalom litzorech. He becomes tameh. But the paradox now is very clear, because the mei chatos, as we said, is a conduit, an agent to bring para, and yet the nogea who touches the mei chatos, he becomes tameh. On that, Shlomo Melech declared, "Amarti echkama v'hi rechoka mimeni." How is it possible that the mazeh is tar because his hazah was litzorech, and the nogea who came in contact with mei chatos but shalom litzorech, he becomes tameh? What power of tumah here? Every tumah that we know of comes from a certain source, whether it's a sheretz or a mess, whether it's ziva or nida, adam, etc. Here, the source of his tumah in the case of nogea is the mei chatos. So again, just to summarize, the Chachamim reject Rabbi Akiva. They will not accept the premise that if you put the mei chatos on a tar, he becomes tameh. That's impossible, because hazah, by definition, is a process by which a person becomes tar, not tameh. So how could it be that through this hazah, a tar becomes tameh? But on the other hand, the Chacham agree. They don't deny, as Shlomo Melech expressed it, that there's a paradox and a very erratic and irrational principle that's operating here, because the nogea becomes tameh because he came in contact with the source and the agent of tara. How can that be? And that's rechokim. Now the Gemara is not happy with the Chachamim, and I'll tell you why. Because if you read the psukim carefully, there's no way that you could come up with the conclusion that there's a mazeh and that there's an nogea. So now let's look inside We're on Daf Yudalid Amid Aleph. Everything I gave you until now is just an introduction for background. And we're going to look for the line of V'chimazetar, which you will see about, I would say, 3/4 of the way down the Amud. So the Gemara asks, V'mazetar? Are you telling me that the one who sprinkles the hazah on the tameh, he remains tar? Baksiv, let's read the pasuk in Parshas Chutka. Straightforward. Umaze me hanida, yechabes begada. Now, kibus begadim means that when you contract tumah, you now transmit that tumah to the begadim that you're wearing. So how could it be that the mazeh remains tar and yet his begadim became tameh? That makes no sense. It must mean that the mazeh himself, who does the azah, becomes tameh with the tumah chamura, such an intense, strict tumah, that he transmits the tumah to his begadim, which is something that is very, very unusual. Now, there's something that moves the Chachamim to reinterpret this pasuk, and not to interpret it what we call al derech hapshat, pshuto shel mikru, because pshuto shel mikru, mazeh meinida yechapes b'gadav, indicates that the mazeh is tameh, which the Chachamim reject. So I wanted to read to you an insight here of the Marome Soda, that's the Nitziv Mivalosh, and he bases himself on a certain reading of Rashi. And he says the following. The Torah says, V'hizah hatar al hatameh. The word hatar indicates that he is a tar, meaning he remains a tar. So that means V'hizah hatar. It's not just that for that moment of hazah he's a tar, and then all of a sudden, a minute later, after he does hazah, he becomes tameh. He's called and described and categorized as a tar, and therefore the Chacham came to the conclusion that the mazeh remains tar even after the hazah, and therefore the Chachamim had no choice. But they had to reinterpret the pasuk, and the word umazeh is reinterpreted. He says that the one who becomes tameh, because it says yechabes b'gadav. Follow what's going on here. The Chachamim are faced with what you might call shnei ksuma machichin. One pasuk says V'hizah tar al hatameh, which means he remains tar. The other pasuk says that mazeh meinida yechabes b'gadav, which implies that he's tameh. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? And the answer is my mazeh. What does the word mazeh mean in this context? Nogea. He has contact with the mechatos, and he has not implemented a hazah. He may have done a hazah, but it's shalol litzarech. If he does hazah litzorech, and that is the mitzvah of v'hizah hatar al hatameh, that's exactly what the Torah mandates, then hatar means he remains tar. That's the mazeh. But comes along someone, and he comes in contact with the mechatos, and he has no hazah, because hazah shalol litzorech is not a hazah. So if he's not involved in that mandate, fulfilling the will of Hashem, to be mazal atar, in order on al tameh to be matar the tameh, then the Torah says v'chibes b'gadav. The nogea now becomes tameh. Gemara is not happy. Vaksiv, if you read the pasuk carefully, not only does it say umaze meinida yechabes b'gadav, but it also says in the next part of that same pasuk, hanogea b'meinida yitma haaretz. It's crystal clear that there's a maze and there's an ogea. They are given two names in the very same verse. It cannot be that the word maze is to be interpreted as an ogea, because in the end of the pasuk it says, "V'anogea b'meinida yitma ad haaretz." Why would the Torah just repeat itself? It starts with one word, maze, and then it concludes with the word nogea. Can't be. The Od, and furthermore, look what the Torah says about the maze at the beginning of the pasuk and the nogea at the end of the pasuk. At the beginning of the pasuk, maze boy kibus b'gadim. The Torah says explicitly, maze mei nida yechabes b'gadim. But nogea lo boy kibus b'gadim. In the case of the nogea, in the very same pasuk, it says vanogea b'mei nida yitma ad haaretz. He just has tumas eretz. That's all he has. He doesn't have that power of tumah to transmit the tumah to his begadim, such that the Torah would say b'chibes begadim. So you see clearly that the Torah is referring to two different individuals. One is the maze, and he's doing a hazah l'tairas hatame, l'tzorech, as we said, and then there's an ogea. And with regard to the maze, the Torah says that he contracts tumah v'chibes begadim. With regard to the nogea, his tumah is a tumas aret, without kibus begadim. So the Gemara now retracts what it said before, and we have to reinterpret the pasuk according to the Chachamim in order to differentiate between the reisha of the pasuk umaze and the seif of the pasuk hanogea. Says the Gemara, Elamai maze nose. Now we introduce another concept called a nose. And a nose who literally carries the mechatos, he becomes tameh with a tumah chamura, a much more severe level of tumah, such that v'chibes begadav, he transmits that tumah to his begadav. Why? Because he's a nose. And the end of the pasuk is an ogea. Nogea, who is not nose. He's not carrying and relocating the mechatos. He's just having contact with the mechatos shalol l'tzor. So we now have three different individuals in the same context. We have the maze, and the Chacham say umaze hatar means that he remains tar. He's the one who is mandated and is fulfilling the kiyum mitzvah of hazah on a tameh. He remains tar. He's protected from any tumah. Then we have someone who is endowed with a tumah chamura of kibus gadin. He's called the nose. He carries the mechatos. Now we have a third category, which is somewhere in between the two polar extremes, and that's an ogea. An ogea who's not a nose is then there's no v'chibus begadav. He gets a lighter kind of tumah, and he's tamei out of earth. Now, I just want to add a comment here of Tosfos. Tosfos says that the nose, who we said contracts a tumah chamura, about which he's called the chibes begadav, is dafka if he's noses hamayim shalol l'tzorech hazah. Now watch what Tosfos is pointing out here. It could be that the maze al hatame has to lift up the mechatos in whatever receptacle it is in order to relocate it. So he now becomes a nose. Says Tosfos, he remains tar. Why? Because he's a maze. What makes him a maze and not a nogea, and excuse me, not a nose? It's because he's doing it litzorah for the purpose of being mitayr the tumah. So if the nose is involved in litzorah, he will not contract tumah. Which nose will contract tumah, and even a higher level of tumah? That's the nose shelo litzorah. He's carrying the mechatos, but he has no interest whatsoever, and there's no scenario in which we need his services to sprinkle the mechatos on the tumah. And now, in the note that I have here, he quotes the Vilna Gaon, the Gra. Now, I had doubts as to whether or not to learn this Gra with you because it's a bit complicated, but sometimes when I hesitate to learn something, and then I go ahead and push myself, we have what's called dibuk chaverim, mitoch halimud. So I'm hoping that we'll understand this Gra as we learn it together. The Gra, who writes a commentary on Mishnah, is called Elio Rabbah, and in the case of Para, in the 9th chapter, he writes the following: Be'emes ein hevdel bein maze linnose, bein nose litzorech, linnose shelo litzorech. So far, it's gibberish. He's just simply rejecting everything that we've said until now. Here we built up, with great flavor and excitement, an interpretation. He's completely throwing it out. There's no difference, he says, between a maze and a nose. No difference between a nose litzorech and a nose shelo litzorech. Ella. So what's going on in our sugya? Shemei chatos mitamim b'nisiyasam rakes mi she'einenu tar lechatos. A new concept here called tahar lechatos. And when the Torah says that an ogea, let's talk about a nose first, that a nose contracts tumah, we're talking about someone who's not, in inverted commas, a tar lechatos. Again, there are two categories here. There's someone called a tar lechatos and someone who's not a tar lechatos. Klomar, Misha Taval Vinitar Achlo Taval L'Shem Taras Chatos. So who's this person that contracts tumah by carrying the mechatos? He's someone who's not tar lechatos. It means that according to Vilna Gaon, there's a separate mitzvah of tvila, which has nothing to do with the normal, whatever exists in the constellation of tumah, a tvila l'shem tara. He's already tar, but he needs a tvila. Why? Because he needs to be tar lechatos. Imagine, for everything else in the universe, he's tar, but he's not tar for a chatos. As far as a chatos is concerned, he's a tameh. And he's called, in the language of the Gemara, a nose es mechatos. That's the language that we're using. Again, I don't know how the Gaon is going to fit this into the terminology, but the equation here is between quote unquote a nose and someone who's not tar lechatos. He may have had tefillah. He went to the mikveh for whatever reason, but not for the sake of the chatos, not in order to carry and handle the chatos. He who is in charge of hazav mechatos is required to have a separate tefillah for the purpose of mechatos, and that's called l'shem taras chatos. Is therefore, since the mazer mechatos, if he was in fact and that's what generally he is. He's a tovel litaras chatos, according to the God. You want to be a mazer, you have to apply for the position, submit your resume, your candidacy, and we will require the following requirement. It's not enough that you give us your impressive list of achievements in life and we'll let you be a mazer. You have to now be tovel l'shem taras chatos. Once you do so, then you are protected from the tumah that comes from the chatos. But a nose, in the language of the Gemara, which is not the same as a mazer, means that ulo tiras atzmo lechatos. He didn't undergo a special tefillah to be metayr himself for the chatos, and therefore the mayim are metamim. Both sides, all I can tell you is that the Gaon is revolutionizing the whole sugya.
Gigantic.
The Gaon is imagining that everything in the universe is tar until it becomes tameh. As we would say, everything is innocent until proven guilty. Everything has a cheskes tara, unless we know it became tameh. A sheretz is tameh, a mess is tameh. But everything else in the universe is tar, with one exception. Mechatos. Very odd. Mechatos, and this is something that Shlomo Melech couldn't wrap his head around. Mechatos, on the one hand, is the source of tara, but on the other hand, it has an inherent tumah in it for anyone who gets involved with the mechatos. Now again, the hiza hatorah latame, the tameh is not involved in the mechatos. He's just passively receiving the mechatos. There, the mechatos has the power to be mitayr. However, at the same time, paradoxically, the mechatos has inherent in it the power and the potential to create tumah, to generate tumah. And what's going to be the determining factor, whether by handling the mechatos you indeed contract tumah and the mechatos conveys tumah? It all depends on one question only. Did you experience and undergo a higher level of tara that would protect you from the mechatos? You hear Rabbi say what's going on. The involvement with the mechatos in and of itself is going to be metame you because of your contact with the mechatos, unless you prepared yourself with a separate tefillah that generates for you a higher level of tara, which is called tara lechatos. And if you're lacking the tara lechatos, then the mechatos will be metam. And that's called, in the language of the Gemara, a nose. I just submit to you this Gaon. Again, when you're dealing with paraduma, it's like you can say almost anything because the whole thing defies any rational understanding of the human being. When we study mechatos, we are suspending our greatest endowment, so to speak, the endowment of the intellect that God gave us, because Amati echkama v'hi rechoka mimen. So the Gemara now asks a technical question. V'nichtov rachmanan nosei. Why is the Torah deliberately ambiguous? If you're telling me that there's a fundamental difference between the mazer and the nosei, which again, according to the Gaon, the mazer is the one who had a separate tefillah and was metayr himself for the mechatos, whereas the nosei was not. But in any event, we have these two categories. And again, without the Gaon, we would have said that the mazer is involved in the mitzvah hazah, that's called a tzorech, and the nosei is just he's a prankster, so to speak. You know, he's not involved in the tzorech, he's just having fun moving around the mechatos. I'm exaggerating, but so then there's a distinction fundamentally between the mazer and the nosei. And yet, paradoxically, which word does the Torah use to describe he who becomes tameh? It should have been nosei, but instead it says umazer, because the mazer is v'chibeis b'gada. V'nichtov rachman and nosei my time eksiv mazer. So the Gemara now has to apply the laws of drashos to come up with a new chidush to justify why the Torah, in a very peculiar way, substituted the word nosei for the word maseh. What new chiddush is the Torah teaching? A mashmalon de be'inon shir hazah. So now we're going to have a whole sugi about what is shir hazah. What it means is that the Torah describes a nosei because when you use the word nosei, you're talking about carrying something significant. You wouldn't use the word nosei for someone who picks up an infinite feather or something that's very light. That's not called a nosei. Nosei means like a burden, right? We talk about a masa, like in the case of a beast of burden. So why does the Torah use the word nosei? And the answer is that what was the volume of mechatos inside a receptacle that this Joe lifted up and relocated? It was a nosei. Nosei means a sheer hazah. Now, when we're talking about a volume, a minimal volume of mechatos that has chashivas to it, you could call it a nosei. You have to ask yourself, well, how much water is chashiv? Maybe you want to talk about a revius or a grogeres. The answer is there's got to be enough water there for a hazah. Now, as we discussed last week, hazah requires that you take an eitz azov, which I think translated as a hyssop. Anyway, you have to dip it into the mechatos and then use it for the hazah. Now, if there's such a small volume of mechatos in a kli, it might even be stuck to the rim of the kli, then when you dip the azov, it's not going to absorb and saturate water such that it facilitates the hazah. So the chashivas of mechatos, in terms of its volume, should be measured by its ability and its that it lends itself to hazah, and that's called the lashon hashas shir hazah. But is there really a shir in hazah? That when we do a hazah, in order to be mitayar a tameh, we need a minimum amount of mechatos, and the Gemara is going to explain that what is that minimum amount. Is then we could say that the Torah uses the word nosei to indicate that the reason why the nosei contracted tumah is because it carried a significant shear of mechatos. Elamandi amar hazah ein tzricha shiur. But we're going to see soon that there's one man who says that any small amount of hazah of mechatos is sufficient. There's no minimum chashuv amount of mechatos, even the smallest amount is okay. Is ma'ikal meima. How are you going to explain our distinction here that the reason why, according to Chachamim, the Torah used the word nosei instead of the word mazeh is to teach me that you need a shear? But do you need a shear? Is there a requirement of shear kedei hazah or not? And the Gemara answers, "Hafilu aman diyomer hazah eina tzricha shiur hani mili agaba de gavra aval b'mana tzarich shear." Whoa, this is profound. Rabosa, have you ever learned this sugya before? I mean, if I'm just repeating what you know, then it's chatoy ani maskir. But for me, personally, this is really new. When we talk about a shear of hazah, we mean the minimum amount of hazah for the hazah. In other words, I need a certain volume, according to this man, the Omer shear of hazah, such that now I could be mitayar a tameh through this hazah. Name. Says the Gemara, we're going according to the Mandiyomar that you don't need a shir hazah. If you don't need a shir hazah, what is nosei? We said that the word nosei was deliberately chosen by the Bible in order to indicate that you're carrying a shir hazah. Yes, there is a shir hazah, even according to the Man Yoma, who says that hazah ain't a tzricha shir. We have no requirement of shir in the actual hazah, but we do, according to everyone, have a shir and hazah in the mana. Mana means, that's Aramaic for a kli, a utensil. So therefore, when you say that there's a Man Yoma who says hazah and tzricha shir, he's talking agaba on the back, so to speak, of the gava of the person. When he does hazah, a minimum amount of mechatos is sufficient to be metayr. There's no shear of a volume of mechatos that you need that has to land on top of the back, so to speak, of the tummy in order to be metayr. However, we need that the maza take his azov, right, the stem of this azov branch, and he's got to dip it into a kli. And then after he dips into the kli, he uses the azov as for the hazah. In order for the hazah to be valid, we need a certain minimum amount of mechatos in the kli itself. As far as the mais hazah is concerned, we don't have a shear. There's no minimum amount. But that's because he dipped his azov into a kli that has mechatos. How much mechatos is there in the kli? The answer is we need a shear of hazah, which the Gemara is going to discuss what that is. But the requirement of a volume in the kli itself is unanimously accepted. Nobody questions that. This Snan we learned in the Mishnah in the 12th parak of Parah. You hear this from both sides? Have you ever learned the first 11 prakim of Parah? We're already now fast forwarding to the 12th parak of Masechet Parah. I'm going to have a cow. Anyway, so kama yehei bahen v'yehei kidei hazah. How much mechatos do we need in volume in order that there should be me'azah, that's kosher hazah? Says the Mishnah in Masechet Parah, kidei sheyitbal. Here we have to turn to Amud Beis. Rashi give olim, and we would add 2 words shal azov. Rashi give olim means the top of the stems of this azov branch. V'yazeh. In other words, we need a shear of enough mechatos in the kli so that when you dip the azov into the mechatos that's in the kli, he'll be able to sprinkle it on the tummy. Now, keep in mind that when you dip this azov branch, which has a certain amount of foliage into the mechatos, some of the mechatos will remain absorbed and saturated in the azov. So that in order to get and implement a hazah properly, you need more volume in the kli, or shall I say not more volume, but the volume has to be of enough that when he dips the azov into the water and now he does hazah, there still be water. Again, a mashu, it doesn't matter how much water, but is at least, let's say the volume that would be saturated in the azov is let's call it 10. I'll just throw out a number, right? So it's 10. 10 is absorbed by the eitz azov. The mayim in the kli has to be 10 plus whatever. It doesn't matter whatever. But that's such that after the tevilah of the azov, when the kohen does the hazah and the tameh, some of the water from the mechatos will be sprinkled on the tameh. So now that the kli needs a shear, the Torah uses the terminology noseh. Why? Because a person who's carrying mechatos will only contract tumah if there is a significant amount of mechatos in the kli that he is transporting from place to place. And what is that significant volume? It's the shear of Kidei Lahazos. What does it mean, Kidei Lahazos? We're going according to the Yoma, who says that Hazah ain't a tzricha shir. The answer is the shir has to be in the mayim, that the mayim has a significant value so that it could facilitate the tefillah of the Azov and the subsequent Hazah. Because as we said, the tefillah of the Azov, when he's tovel, it absorbs a certain amount of liquid. Abaye now comes up with a revolution. We've been assuming until now that according to Rabbi Akiva, who maintains that if you do a hazah of mechatos on a tar, he becomes tameh, it's impossible to justify our Mishnah that with Poresh, we mafresh the Kohen Gadol from his house, we bring him into Liskas Farhedron for a week, and during that week, on a daily basis, we do Azov Mechatos, the Kohen Gadol is tar. And according to Rabbi Akiva, as a result of the sprinkling of the Mechatos, he contracts Tumah, and he's therefore disqualified for the Avodah of the Kohen Gadol. The whole purpose is to make him prepared for his Avodah of the Kohen Gadol. Now you're disqualifying him. Abai says, you know what? I'm going to take upon myself the greatest challenge. I am going to reconcile our Mishnah and the entity of Precious Kohen Gadol, Mi Beiso Shevayamin, with Rabbi Akiva's sheet. How does Abai pull this off? In my humble opinion, Abai and Shas is what we call today Einstein. Wherever I see Abai, the man is so original, sometimes too original. Our Mishnah can be reconciled with Rabbi Akiva. The Ovid Avoda Kule Yoma. On every one of these 7 days, the Kohen Gadol is preparing his expertise and he's being trained for the Avoda from dawn to dusk, or almost dusk. In other words, towards the end of the day, which is called Lefanya. Lefanya means towards twilight, I guess you'd call it, or right before twilight. Madu Ale. That's when they do the Hazah. 1 minute, so to speak, that's my own language, before the sun sets, at the end of a long day in which the Kohen Gadol was preoccupied with training and doing the Avodah in preparation for the Yom Kippur. 1 minute before the end of the day, we sprinkle him with Mei Chatas, which according to Rabbi Akiva means that now the Kohen Gadol becomes Tameh. However, it's what's called a Tumas Erev. Tumas Erev means that from one day to the next, or to be more precise, from one day till sunset of that same day, he becomes tar. Again, he has to go to the mikvah, but he becomes tar. So by doing the Azah 1 minute before the end of the day, with sunset of that day, a minute later, he becomes tar. And he goes to the mikvah. The next morning, he does the avodah of the next day. Vitara, he's tar. Let's read it inside. Ulefanya madu ale. At the end of the day, in fancy Hebrew, towards the end of the day, it's called Lifnos Erev. Mazin olav mechatos v'nitma behem. He becomes Tomei, but he's only Tomei until sunset. So therefore, v'tovil, he goes to the mikveh at night. The Ovid Harei Shemesh, the sun is already set, so he had that period of time until, from the Hazah until sunset. And with sunset, he becomes tar. Tomorrow, he goes back, starts a day fresh with the avodah of the next day. It's true that according to Rabbi Akiva, he becomes Tomei from Hazah. Shayu mazin ol b'chol yom mishivas hayomim. Ela shayu osim zos lifnos erev li'acher shesiyam es avodosa shalos hayom li'acher kach hayetomel u'miyad li'acher mikem b'shkiyas hacham hayenitma nitar v'kach lemochras. Every day this repeats itself for 7 days. He adds one thing that I didn't say. I didn't gather this from the Gemara. He says that the moment after he finishes the avod of the day, the moment that they sprinkle on him a chatos is early enough so that he can go to mikvah before shkiyas hachama. And now with shkiyas hachama he becomes tor, and the very next day he's tor. Okay, now let's try to understand why the Chachamim rejected this possibility. Okay, 1 second. Where I know I underlined it. Give me a minute to find it. All right. I apologize, I can't find it, but I'll tell you what I saw. The Chachamim find Rabbi Akiva's setup antithetical. The whole purpose of the 7 days is to guarantee and protect the Tara of the Kohen Gadol. And the Tvilos and the Hazos during these 7 days are all Hazos L'Shem Tara. Chachamim could not tolerate the concept that we're going to subject the Kohen Gadol on a daily basis to Hazah Hamitames. That is exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do. All our efforts during this week of Prisha are meisim that we do for the sake of Tara. I mean, of course, to train him in the Avodah as well, but certainly Tara. Why do we take him out of his house? The Mishnah says we took him out of his house to quarantine him in the Lishkas Farhedrin, in the outskirts of the Azorah, so that he wouldn't become a Tomei Balkeri if he had an intimate relationship with his wife. So the whole purpose here is to be Matayr him. And in fact, if we derive the din of Prishas Kohen Gadol from Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael that go up, to meet with the Almighty God, and they had to be Matayr themselves. And now you're telling me that according to Rabbi Akiva, we advocate a Maisa Hazo, which is Matame him, he's actually Tameh. Then he goes to the mikvah, Hariv Shemesh, he becomes tar, but we didn't act to be Matame him. That's antithetical. Now, to defend Rabbi Akiva, we would suggest the following: that Rabbi Akiva thinks that dafka by going through Tumah and then Tara on a daily basis, that itself is a training for Tara. It reminds him of how careful he has to be Matayr himself, because immediately after we did Azah, we compelled him, so to speak, to go into the mikvah and be Matayr himself, so it'll be tar for the next morning. So this Tumah that we're Matayr him with Azah, according to Rabbi Akiva, is only a means to an end. It's another way of training the Kohen Gadol towards tar. Okay. So this, my friends, wraps up the sugya of Rabbi Akiva. Now, the next sugya that we're about to learn is a question of sequence. Much of Kodshim, as you know, is about what's called the Seder Avodah. And the day in the Beis HaMikdash, as far as the Avodas HaKohanim, ends with one of two things. The way we know it, the way we would thought, it ends with Hadlakas HaNeros, because twice during every day unit, there was Hadlakas HaNeros. Once in the morning that opened up the Beis HaMikdash, and one at the end of the day, and that closed the door, so to speak, on the Avodah of that day. There's another avoda where the Torah says ba'erev, and that's the aktoras haktoras. And once the Torah uses the word ba'erev, it indicates towards the end of the day. So now we're sort of in a bind. What should be the last involvement of the Kohanim at the end of the day? And we can ask this question every day of the year. We can ask it on Yom Kippur. Is it going to be the adlochas haneros, or is it going to be the aktoras haktoras? Our Mishnah says, umaktiras haktoras umeitivas haneros, clearly, explicitly indicating that the Ketores comes first and the Neros comes second. So the Gemara says, Alma Ketores Beresha v'Hadar Neros. We begin with Ketores and then we go on to Neros, and that's fine. Uraminu, but what do we do with a Mishnah in Tamid? And it says the following: Tamid is that Masechta which you need to learn the Seder Avoda of every day. And it says the following: they took a lottery on a daily basis to determine which Kohen would be Zocha B'Payis, and he would get to do the Avoda of the Neros. Misha Zocha B'Dishun Mizbeach HaPnimi, Umisha Zocha B'Menorah, Umisha Zocha B'Ktoris. So we're talking now about three different activities that are obligatory for the Kohanim on a daily basis. One is called Dishon HaMizbeach. As you know, on top of the Mizbeach, there was a Marocha, there was an Eish, and that's where they brought and were maktir all the Imurim, and at the end of the day, they had to clear out all the ashes. That's called Dishon Mizbeach HaPnim. Now, every Kohen wanted the opportunity to get that mitzvah, but they did a lottery. Number two, the menorah. Who wouldn't want to get a chance to light the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash? And this was again an issue of a lottery. And finally, the Ketores. And you can imagine the Kohanim were excited about the opportunity to do the Avodas HaKetores. The Gemara tells us that the Ketores is a special skula for Ashirus, for getting wealthy. Who doesn't want to be wealthy? Now, this Mishnah goes into great detail about how to bring the Ketores, how to offer the Ketores. And the Mishnah goes on. I mean, we're only seeing one, introduction to the Mishnah. In any event, when the Mishnah continues and delineates the Seder of these last two avodos, namely menorah and ketores, the Mishnah says that Hatovas Haneros took place before the Haktoras HaKetores. And you can see it in that little fraction, that segment of the Mishnah that we quoted. It says Misha Zocha b'menorah, Umisha Zocha b'Ketores. And that gives you the impression that the Ketores came afterwards. But the Mishnah says that what's called Hatovas Haneros, which we'll talk about, comes before Haktoras HaKetores. Now, our Mishnah says explicitly, Maktiras HaKetores Umeitivas Haneros. The Mishnah in Tamid says the opposite, that the Neros comes first and only then the Haktoras HaKetores. Is there any way of reconciling the two Mishnayos? Amar Rav Huna man Tana Tamid, Rabbi Shimon, each ha-mitzvahu. The Mishnayos of Tamid were organized by one particular Tana. That was his job. He took over Masechet Tamid. His name was Rav Shimon from the Mitzpeh. And when the Brisa quotes the Seder of the Avodas Hayom, and it starts with the Tamid, and then it goes on to the various Karbanos, that Mishnah Seder Avoda in Masechet Tamid reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon Ish Mitzpeh. Our Mishnah disagrees and rejects this sheet of Rabbi Shimon and has the Ketores first and then the Atovas HaNevis. So the Gemara is not happy with this. But if Chashamin, I'm going to quote you the Mishnah in Tamid, and you're going to see from the Mishnah in Tamid that Adarabah, Reb Shimon Ish Mitzpeh is the cholek, he's the dissenting opinion. It's not that he is reflecting his opinion in the Mishnah. Tisnan, we learned in Masechet Tamid, and this is a reference to the Tamid Shel Shachar. It says, Bolo lekeren mizrachis tzfonis. Right, the Mizbeach was a square, and there was an eastern side that bordered on the north. We'll call it northeastern side of the Mizbeach, and that's where he's going to do the Zrika. He stands there on the Ritzvah Hazor, Nosein Mizracha Tzfona. He places the dam, or actually, that's not a good word, not placing the dam, that's called Shficha, but rather Zrika. He does a Zrika on the dam, on that side of the Mizbeach, which is called Mizracha Tzfona. And then what's going to happen is that the dam now rolls down the Mizbeach, and it gets to that corner of what's called the Yesoda Mizbeach, which is the northeastern side of the Mizbeach, which is fine. Now, why are we doing it in that way that should reach that point, which is the meeting point between the east and the north? And the answer is because it's very important that the dam would be applied to both the Mizrach side and the Tzafon side of the Mizbeach. And now, by doing this Zrika at that corner, it's going to be like two different Zrikos. And that right angle of east and north, which is called the Zavis Mizrachis Tzfonis, that is the point in which he should be doing the Zrika. And he says, Umekomo bizavis hamizrachis tzfonis, beholech umakifo, makifis hamizbech mitzad sofon, upone lamara. Now the dam will flow from the northern side going down towards the southern side. But I have to add one other point that I omitted, and we're talking about Mizrach. So it's really on the eastern side, but now it reaches the eastern side and then sort of turns towards the west. So we started with the northeastern and we end with the southwestern. Is no saying Min Adam Bizrika Marova Droma on the southwestern side. And that's called the Kiluach. That's the way the dam flows. Okay, Vitani Allah. And then it says, in that very brisa, it says Rabbi Shimon ben Ish Mitzvah, Mishana, he changes the whole Seder of Nesina Saddam, B'Tamid of the carbon Tamid, not the way we saw it at the beginning. And according to him, it's Mizrachis Tzfonis, and then Nosein Dam, the Dam of the Zrika, Mizracha Tzfona. So we're talking about the northeastern side, not like we saw before. And he says that he starts with the Mizrachis Tzfonis, and Nosim in Adam Mizracha Tzafona. It goes towards the northeast, from the northeast. It goes Mizrachis Tzfonis to Maravis Dronis. and then it goes is Marava, then it goes towards the west. V'achkach nosein daroma, and then he puts some of the dam on the Durham. So what is the machlokus here between the Tanakama and Rav Shimon Ish Mitzvah? It has to do with the way he does the dam of the Korban Tamid. And we see clearly from this Tosefta that it is not Rav Shimon Ish Mitzvah who authored the Mishnayos and the Tosefta, but rather he is the dissenting view. We don't understand how to reconcile this with Rav Huna, who says, Man Tana de Tamid, it was Rav Shimon Ish Mitzvah. Rav Shimon Ish Mitzvah is quoted here in the Tosefta as the dissenting view.